wait for the professor, but let's continue with our casual chat. Hasala, you were saying about the commissioners and how they were appointed?
I just wanted to know who the original commissioners were, just to get an idea of what was happening. But and just the point on how policy was given to the commission, and I felt that there was an issue here. But anyway, so there was a distinction between 2002 and 2009 in the wording of it. They have changed it. Like in the 2002, it says that the cabinet of ministers instructs or gives the policy to the power minister, who provides that to the utilities commission. Whereas in 2009, it's more like just the minister does whatever he wants. That's what the understanding I got. If you can just get it up, like it should be in, it should be online. The act should be online. Yeah, but
I try to sort of read through the text and understand who is really in charge of the sort of making policy. Oh, I think we have Professor. Hello, Professor. How are you?
Good. Let me change my background.
No worries. We have.
This is. Let me see. But I'm not that competent in this.
No worries, Professor. We have another Toastmaster with us, Hasala. I think we got to know in university we are the Toastmasters of the gavel, right? Or like also with that.
Yeah, because this was used by my wife. She was not something. Let me see where is it? Where is it?
So you go to stop video. There is on the second on the bottom you have a stop video icon,
right.
and then there's an arrow you have to click, which points to the ceiling.
Right.
In there you can change choose virtual background and none. Choose none for that if you want to. But we can have Toastmasters too. I mean,
it's supposed to be like a casual chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. For a change, let me have a different background.
All right. I'm going with the California theme.
How's this?
Excellent.
This is from Nepal, actually.
Oh.
This is Nepal India interconnection.
It even looks a little bit like a tropical forest that you have in the background. Slightly tropical, I'd say.
Oh yeah. Because Nepal Tarai region, you would believe this is only this area must be around only about 50 meters above mean sea level.
Oh.
Yeah, only 50. Tarai region is so low elevation.
Okay, excellent. So I think are we all good to start? I think we can.
Yeah, good to start. You can see me properly.
And, excellent.
Good.
I think we have a good attendees, attendees in our Zoom webinar, but also on Facebook. Lots of people who are joining live.
Good.
And so before I really, I'll make a short introduction of the professor, and then I'll sort of introduce the young people, Hasala and Shiana, who's joining with us. I mean, not that you are young too, but I'm saying like the young people, of course.
Real young guys.
Yes. Of course. So let's sort of officially start, and I wanna really thank and welcome Professor Priyantha Wijayatunga, who I've known since an undergraduate at when I was an undergraduate at University of Moratuwa, and of course he's been a big inspiration for me even to choose a career in the energy sector. And Professor Priyantha Wijayatunga is a well-known name in the energy sector in Sri Lanka. Sometimes I was telling Shiana yesterday that it's difficult to decouple the personality from the industry in Sri Lanka, and that's why sort of we are trying to understand you and your perspective, how you also grew, sort of evolved with the energy sector. Has the energy sector evolved in Sri Lanka? So Professor Priyantha is, of course, better known, or I don't know, like people know him as like the big energy sector policy person, or maybe the godfather of the energy sector right now. I don't know if you'll agree, but but he was also the founding director general of the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka, and which sort of was an important step in the evolution of the energy sector, the regulatory structure in Sri Lanka. And our topic, sort of for this second energy talk, we are focusing on the important forces, the public forces, and of course the restructuring forces that happened during the 90s and early 2000. I think for our last episode, we had a good background from Dr. Tilak Simbalapitiya on what happened during the 80s and before that. And today, of course, we are joined by my colleague Hasala and Shiana Gunasekara. Shiana is, I met Shiana in Washington, D.C. Of course, she has a Sri Lankan heritage. Before I maybe explain about, Shiana's interests, Shiana, would you like to sort of do like a brief introduction and sort of why you think, young people or why people should be excited about this field?
Sure. So thank you again for having me on. I think you guys can hear me all well.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. Well, again, I'm Shiana Gunasekara. I'm currently a senior associate, an international energy consultant at Berkeley Research Group here in Washington, D.C. And so I get to work on energy projects all around the world, but Sri Lanka obviously has a special place in my heart, given my heritage. I think that young people should be interested in understanding their countries or their ancestral countries' energy policies, because for me, I see, like, as a Sri Lankan American, I have a bit more of an objective perspective of the political economy going on in Sri Lanka. But at the same time, I have a personal investment in seeing the country do well, to prosper. And so, given those motivations, I see that one of the major constraints for Sri Lanka's economic growth is really, reliable electricity supply and being able to meet the growing demand of the country. And so I think, young people are going to be encountering, some more power cuts and whatnot if they don't voice their opinions of what's going on and how, different reforms and policies can affect their future. So I think this is something, this is a great initiative that you guys have taken, and it's important to really be able to distill some of the jargon that you see in the energy world and specifically in policy making.
Thank you, Shana. Yes, I mean, it's great to have you also, especially, representing a sort of diverse opinion and background. I think Shana is someone who knows enough about Sri Lanka, but also will like bring an outsider, like an interesting, different opinion to our discussion. I think because Sri Lankan energy experts tend to be sort of cornered with the same kind of opinions and the discussion sometimes. So let me sort of move to Hasala, maybe and because Hasala is like a proper insider into Sri Lanka's energy sector, and he's someone who has actually given expert opinions and public comments in like a utilities commission here in Sri Lanka and also in the US. Hasala, isn't that right?
Yeah, so I am not an expert on especially on regulatory business. I'm just an advocate. That's how. So for me, I came into this business. Dr. Tilak inspired me, and there was Mr. Ranjit Fonseca, the late Mr. Ranjit Fonseca, who was the past general manager and who was a teacher, a lecturer at my university for 2 semesters. So they inspired me. But I was always an advocate on different things. But I just read these reports. I gave in, and I had they asked for comments. I went in and gave my comments. It was not expert, but they were comments, and I got involved in each and every public hearing that was there from like I think 2010 to 2015. So starting from the rate case, that the Public Utilities Commission put when they started out. And then I also had the opportunity, even though I'm not an American, even though I'm a Sri Lankan, because I was a customer of Duke Energy. Am I too loud, Tisura?
Maybe a little bit, but I don't think that's a problem.
Yeah. How is it now?
Much better. Yes. Go on, Asala.
Yes. So when they asked for a rate, they had a rate case in 2018. Duke Energy, which is one of the largest utilities in US, they had a rate case. I was a customer, and I asked to be a pro se litigant. I applied to be a pro se litigant, even though I was not an expert. I was the only pro se litigant that they got into. The petition was called by the commission, and they got me into the commission, into the system where I had a lot of like information on what's happening in South Carolina. So I participated in South Carolina rate case very actively as well. So that's just my background. I'm no expert, but I'm more of a interest party, I would say.
Of course. I mean, glad to see, someone so young as Hustler in our age as Hustler really being active in, really rate making cases and making your voice out. And of course, before I go to Professor, I want to sort of let the audience attendees know if you have any questions along the way, sort of please type them, in like the chat box in Zoom. Also, you can sort of submit them on Facebook as like a comment. All relevant questions will be taken up, relevant to the topic on the regulatory and future-looking questions will be taken up. And without keeping Professor Priyantha Wijayatunga waiting any longer, so let me really welcome Professor again and thank you for accepting our humble invitation. As of course Shiana and Hassala mentioned, I think let me also add on to saying that our motivation is to make sure that, a younger generation of electrical engineers, but of course, not just engineers, but young people in general, take all the knowledge that, you have, like, all the experts who have really shaped and reshaped the energy sector in Sri Lanka, and for us to absorb all the sort of your experience from us so that we will sort of be, better equipped or better knowledgeable sort of to address the future energy problems. So Professor, to get things started, let me sort of say, why can you tell us, maybe as a young person, maybe as an undergraduate in, back in the good old days, can you tell us what got you interested in the energy sector, energy field in the beginning, and what really motivated you to be part and parcel of it back in the good old days?
Thank you very much, Teshwara, Shihana, and Hasala. And it's good to see you all. And maybe just still, online. That's fine. It's always good to see you all. And hope you all can hear me well, right? Is it okay? Yeah, good, great. Okay. Yeah, it's quite interesting actually. Even during my childhood, I used to love electricity. I used to, do all small repairs, small things at home. And I used to get electric shocks quite often because I touched both negative and positive, both hands. And I used to, repair things without even switching off my main switch. Simply because my house is an ancestral home of my father, and I can still remember the electric wiring was very old, and I lost my father when I was very young, and my mother, only my mother could switch off the main switch because it was so strong and so difficult to switch off. So I usually do repairs even without switching off the mains. And I usually touching the wires separately, but sometimes once in a way I used to touch both together, and then I used to get an electric shock even. So, but anyway, I used to like electricity even at the time. And but then when I went to the university, as you know, all of you have gone through this orientation program. All these top professors come and speak to you. How your life is going to be in the university, and how nice to do this, how nice to do that, and every person, let's say a professor from chemical engineering would like to come and tell chemical engineering is the best thing to do in the world, and then you have some others coming in and the best thing to do is computer science or electronics or mechanical, that's how they sell their field of specialization during orientation, and you wouldn't have even thought of what you are going to do, at the time. But then this professor, I don't know whether you all know Professor Sam Kanwaratne. the founding professor of the electrical engineering department, and he was the person who introduced electrical engineering to the freshers, newcomers in the orientation program. I can still remember him telling he never promoted electrical engineering during his speech. And he used to say that it's so difficult. This is a difficult field of engineering, and you have to do this, you have to do that. Getting a first class is so difficult in electrical engineering. You know, all sorts of difficult things if you are going to do electrical engineering. Then I can still remember telling one of my friends, I think we should do electrical engineering because he is challenging us so much that we can't do it. Anyway, I like electrical engineering. So during my time, we do electrical engineering, but both electronics and electrical used to be together. And then only in the final year, we separate into soft current or electronics and telecommunication and electrical power engineering. So that's up to third year. End of third year, we used to do the same curricula. But anyway, so that's how I ended up doing electrical engineering. I liked it, but at the same time, it was a challenge at the time of getting into the university. Then after graduation, of course, then you think that what you should do, specialize within electrical engineering. You could have done machines, you could have done power electronics at the time, you could do various other things. But I always liked power economics, power system economics. And I used to write to a professor in Imperial College at the time, called Professor Dr. Brian Corey. And he is no more, he late Brian Corey. And I used to be almost like a pen friend those days. We never had, email or internet or anything. We had to write, a letter, and we get a letter, response within a month or something, And so he was kind of a pen friend. He used to, why don't you start reading this book, that book, and it's all power economics. And I used to like it. And then eventually I ended up in Imperial College because I eventually get a scholarship from them. And that's how it proceeded. So I ended up doing eventually power system economics, naturally, which is more close to policy regulatory work than hardcore electrical engineering. So I shifted to policy regulatory type of work. Then I came back and expanded. And then, as we go, I will explain to you how I ended up as a regulator. So that's my beginning.
It's interesting to hear, actually writing a letter to someone in a different country with paper, pen and paper. Can't even imagine. Shiana, did you have a sort of follow-up question to this?
Yeah. Well, I know that you eventually pursued your PhD. That's correct, right? So what made you decide to do that? I mean, that's, you're a professional student at that point. I know the other two PhD students would agree, I'm sure, but what made you decide to potentially pursue a career in academia, or was that not your end goal?
Yeah, one thing, after graduation, I really wanted to pursue, further studies, number one. That was my, interest. But then I can still remember, Professor Karnarata had his own contacts with IBM Sri Lanka. And that was the place they used to offer the best salaries and best jobs. And so I was one of his favorite students. So he asked me, Priyantha, would you like to take up that job? And there was this one vacancy. And I can remember the salary could have been somewhere in the range of about 6,000 rupees a month. And at the time, the salary of an assistant lecturer, we call it in the academia, when you join as a junior lecturer, it used to be exactly 2,040 rupees. That's exactly the amount. So it's about almost 3 times, Then he told me, he gave a little more information and said, okay, that's fine. And but keep in mind, you can get more money in IBM, but then you will be stuck there. And you might progress, and that's one part of your career. And then if you come back to academia, you may get a lower salary and it may not be so good, but then you have the opportunity to go up and study more and progress in your career as an academic. And so that I like. And I wanted to really learn something more. But interestingly, you would believe I hated exams. And probably this is something which most of my colleagues and my friends don't know. I hated exams. I thought after doing the final exams in the university degree, I thought no more exams. exams in the sense written exams. You have to, learn things by heart sometimes, and go through. I always love to reproduce things. When I know that you can find it somewhere, I just don't want to, kind of learn it by heart. I just say, okay, I know where it is. When I want it, I go and find out. So that means basically it's very difficult to do written exams as such, like that. So I never liked it. So that's the reason why I never did a master's. You wouldn't believe. I always wanted to do a PhD because UK PhD is basically strictly research. 3 years of hardcore research, and you produce a thesis, and you learn a lot by yourself. You talk to people, and you end up with a thesis and a PhD at the end of the day, and no written exams. And it's so self-satisfying because every minute you like every minute of your PhD work. I can remember I used to spend time in the lab until about 12 o'clock midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. And I really loved it. Basically simulation, or power system simulation for various models and so on. Yeah, so that's how it was, yes.
Okay, yes. Thank you for the soft introduction about yourself, Professor. So I think, and I'm also fascinated. Here in the US, it takes at least about 4 to 5 years to do a PhD, even with a master's. I think those are the good times, I think. So I think, so to really get into the topic of today's discussion, can you sort of tell us about what happened during the 1990s in Sri Lanka? So I was probably I was like less than 10 years old back then in the 90s and early 2000. And the thing I remember about the energy sector was there was this power cuts. There would be like a schedule saying from 6 to 8 or like 8 to 10, something like that during when President Chandrika Bandanaikumartunga was in power. And then, the other thing I remembered was that people really hated the government in power because of the power cuts, and there was like a crisis brewing. And of course, reading back about the past, I sort of learned that it was in 1996 that really the independent power producers, sort of some competition in the generation sector was allowed into an industry that was sort of heavily monopolized by the government utility. And of course, the other change that happened was hydropower used to have like a super majority in the 80s and 90s, even a 2/3 majority, and even before in the beginning of the 90s. But towards the latter part, sort of we had initiated a trend where more and more petroleum, more and more heavy fuel sort of came into the system. And of course, that trend has continued right now. I think coal and petroleum tends to be the majority sometimes. Can you comment on that, Professor? And a little bit, how things were when you came back from your PhD, what was that year, and what were the forces, trends that was going on in Sri Lanka at the time?
Yeah, I would say, of course, apart from other issues we had in the power sector, I think the golden times were the 80s and early 90s to start off with. The reason being that, as you know, Mahavali project, it ended up with so many large hydropower plants, and we added about over 660 megawatts or so in all these power plants. And of course, government intervention, government interest in the sector is the one which really brought all these power plants into the system. And it was kind of economic development. It was a booming time as far as economic development is concerned. And as you know, after liberalization in late 70s, our economy was growing so fast, and in fact, power was a major input to the system, and we really needed more power. So at the time, the government really took initiatives to bring in enough power in time. And initially there were some gas turbines brought in to basically as a stopgap measure, and then there was a longer term plan to add in hydropower to the system. So in late 80s and 90s were basically the best times in that sense, early 90s. Because the government had the interest to add power plants to satisfy the demand, which was growing very, very fast. Then gradually, I must say, the interference in the sector was so much, particularly in the generation sector. Timely addition of power plants had been an issue right throughout since early 90s, I must say. So whether the power plants were to be oil-fired or coal-fired or hydropower or whatever, the decisions were not taken on time. And obviously, Ceylon Electricity Board produced its plans, and but the government obviously had their own interests sometimes, or had their own plans, or perhaps not taking things seriously and not considering the lead time to put up a power plant and all that, and then ended up all these generation issues. But until early 90s, I can remember, I think it's almost 100% hydro, almost. Only during certain periods of droughts that we brought in, this thermal power plants, mainly Kalanidhi's steam and gas turbine plants. Only as a stopgap.
Exactly. It was like a very proud time for engineers back in the days. I remember my parents also, they wouldn't shut up about all the hydropower projects that was going on at the time.
Exactly. And your mother was only 1 year junior to me. And so those were the golden days, I must say. Then always it's one after another, the crisis, power sector, and very thin reserve margins, not power plants added on time, and then naturally when it comes to last minute requirements, you have to add liquid fuel plants, because these are the ones which can be brought in very fast. And when you don't have longer term plans properly implemented, naturally you come up, like your standby generators, they are very fast. You can buy off the shelf and then put in into the system. It's very similar. So we ended up with all the liquid fuel power plants, and they were also mostly heavy fuel sometimes, and auto diesel, and sometimes emergency generators, as which are run with auto diesel. So they were very expensive power plants. And when these power plants come, they never go away also, because unless you at least get back to the long-term power generation plan, you will never be able to, correct this situation. So after, I think, early 90s, always we had issues. Always we had issues. Of course, when the issue is so significant, then you have power cuts. And otherwise, you barely manage. You barely manage. And then 1996, and then, I can't remember, there were, every 3-4 years, we used to have such issues. And in 2002 also, if I can remember right. And so that was an issue. Then, of course, this is the time that the whole world was going through power sector reforms. And then we started looking at that also. This is the time, actually I came back from London in 1992.
Okay.
That's the time actually, around early 90s, British power system was privatized. And I was in fact inside that whole exercise, because my PhD research was on pricing transmission services. In fact, I used to model the national grid power system, or UK, England and Wales power system, to price its use of its network. And my project was used to be sponsored by National Grid Company. So we used to have models for that pricing. So I came back in 92 with all this big, news of power sector reforms, and now how systems can go through this and so on. And in fact, ADB and the World Bank at the time was quite interested in taking power sector reforms forward in these countries like Sri Lanka. So that was basically the order of the day in 90s. And then the rest of it, we ended up, power sector. We will talk about it a little later. And yeah.
Of course.
Well, I did have a question on, one, what you were talking a little bit about the global trends at the time. Could you talk about the trends that were happening in South Asia specifically? And then my other question is, could you speak a little bit about setting up the structure of the IPPs? I'm curious to know how privatized entities were introduced into, a largely public service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as far as South Asia is concerned, I think if I can remember right, somewhere in mid-90s, India started the power sector reforms with Orissa power sector reforms, and basically the same model which they used to apply in the developed world, that is, unbundling, transmission, generation, transmission, and distribution, and both horizontally and vertically. And that was being introduced both by ADB and the World Bank in this region, the South Asia region, and that's what was tried out even in Sri Lanka. And as you know, by 2002 we had an Electricity Act which introduced unbundling of the Ceylon Electricity Board into several companies, and both horizontally and vertically, and similar structures were introduced in India, and even in Bangladesh they started doing it, and they thought of doing the same thing in Nepal and so on. So India progressed, right? Starting from 90, India progressed. Of course, as you know, Orissa is a real failure, the way it was privatized and so on. But then they learned from those lessons and then moved on. And they did not stop privatizing. They did not stop power sector reforms. They basically learned through the mistakes and they improved on it, and they went through it. Now, if you look at India now, more or less all unbundled systems all over. I mean, you can't have a single state except some of the smaller states in northeastern region, all unbundled and independent regulators and so on. So Sri Lanka started that at the time, and which was stalled afterwards. As you know, in 2002, Act was introduced and then later on abandoned. And but Sri Lanka introduced private sector participation in generation, if I can remember right, as early as late 80s actually. In mid-90s, they put up a policy, 97 or something, where specifically it said any thermal generation will have to be private sector. So they were very specific on that. But even before, I think in late 80s they brought in, or early 90s, they brought in private sector into, generation business, thermal generation. And if I can remember, there was a power plant in Sapukaskanda, I think, privately owned, and of course competitively bid it out, and then brought in a private sector. So that was,
yeah. Sorry, can you tell us if the electricity law and the legal structure governing the system allowed for private participation at the time, or did anything change in 97, 96 to help that?
I think, I can't remember exactly. I think private sector participation was allowed even before. It was not an issue. I mean, as long as you completely bid it out, and so as long as you have a PPA agreed upon competitively, and if you do it the right way, it was allowed, if I can remember. Because I know before the new Electricity Act came into being, private sector had been in the electricity sector before, generation sector. Actually, the new Electricity Act came into being finally, what was finally approved by the Parliament and gazetted only in 2009, the new Electricity Act. But until then, we had the Electricity Act introduced many years ago. I can't remember when, maybe 1950s or something, which was introduced. And that act, was open to private sector participation. Yeah.
Hasala, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes. So I know it's so long time ago, and but I see that. So I was not like, I was 6 years old, I guess, 1992. So I have a document that I read which says that CB first solicited for IPPs. Can you hear me, Tisura?
We can hear you, Hasala.
Yeah. So in 1992. And a company called KHD from UK gave this. They gave a EOI. They responded to the EOI, and the project was commissioned in 1998. And then in 1996, it was an unsolicited proposal by LTA, Lanka Transformers. So and it was accepted in 1996 and commissioned in 1997. And we know, like. So that was that was 1997, and then there is another request for proposal for barge-mounted power plant in December 1994. I think it was by the CBK government, like that's the time that they came into play. And so this was from the utility, and they commissioned the plant in July 2000. I don't know, maybe this is for Jaffna.
Mhm.
I don't know. But this is
In
what I
fact,
found. And
yeah, so to add to that, I think I had the same question. I was looking at an old World Bank document that was sort of explaining the IPPs and introduction of sort of competition into the generation sector. And sort of they had, based on the percentage of IPPs that were competitively bid, they had sort of separated countries. Some progressive countries like Thailand were doing 100% bids through, competitive bidding. And some countries, I don't want to name names, like, maybe Pakistan, even China was an exception, who had started doing maybe 30% or less of the bidding through competitive biddings. Asala, that's also what you said. And like, you have seen examples to the counter.
yeah, so like I want to ask from Professor Wijayatunga what his take. So I mean, just if he can go back to that, what was his take on like what was happening in the sector? Like if he can remember, like for me, like right now, when what happened with say some of these power plants, I was like enraged. Like I don't want this to happen. Like I was mad. Like when the coal power plant was not getting built in say 2008, 2009, and people not taking decisions. Even before that, like all these issues that came up, I was like totally, I was mad that it was happening, and that, so what were your feelings if you could remember that far out?
Don't hear you, Professor. Professor, we can't hear you for some reason.
Yeah. Can
Ah,
you-
now, now we can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, of course I can remember those good old times. I always say good old times because not having power is also, in a way, you enjoy it differently. Uh, so yeah, it was really, really frustrating, frankly, because when you are young and when you are in the sector, you always think that the things should move very smoothly. You expect the things to move. As you grow older, like me, then things are cannot be as smooth because there are so many other factors coming into the scene. It's not that easy. So I mean, at the time, I was really we used to be mad that coal power plant was not getting into place in time and all that. Now you know how difficult to take that decision now. It's not that easy. It's not that easy because there are so many factors. So that's why, at the time I can remember, after coming back from my studies in London, for many years I used to believe strictly, you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do that, and so on. Then I can remember how I always used to read in planning. People say when you have a plan needs to be implemented. I used to teach a course in the master's course at the university, and I used to say that if you take different steps of planning and implementation of plans, I always say it's the responsibility of the planner to produce plans, and it cannot be just one plan. You have to have several alternative plans, and it is up to the decision maker, the policy maker, the government, the people who have elected these people. They are the people who should take the final decision. We say Ceylon Electricity Board should produce the long-term generation plan, and then government should implement it. I never used to believe that. I always used to say that no, if you produce all these alternatives to the government, okay, you can have the next best plan, and it will cost us this much more if you want to implement it. But it is the government, particularly in a democratically elected government, it is the government which represents people, and the government should take the decision. And for that decision to take that decision, the government needs a few alternatives, not just one. And so now looking back, I think the government, I don't know, government may not have done the right thing, but government had always the right to question whether we should build this power plant or do something else. And probably the questions asked may be with certain interested parties backing them and so on. That's a different story. But there would have been many other factors which should have been considered beyond what we engineers think at the time. So that delayed, but that was frustrating, of course, no doubt. Yeah.
Professor, if I can make you put on the regulator hat and sort of not the engineer hat right now, I wonder, can you tell us a little bit about the political forces, the social forces, the political economy of things, you know, sort of unraveling in the late 90s and the early 2000s that sort of led to the Electricity Act of 2001, and of course the creation of the Public Utilities Commission, and of course, and how the people felt about IPPs, or at least if the people actually knew about the IPPs. You sort of, can you be a sociologist and sort of explain, like, you know, as you said, you know, you can be idealistic, and then there are the actual forces that lead to change. What were those actual forces, you know, in a way?
Yeah, as I said, I mean, 90s, it was the order of the day. Like all the development partners, and particularly the World Bank and the ADB, they really wanted to implement power sector reform, the models which they had in the developed countries, unbundling, you know, horizontally, vertically, regardless of the system size. Let's go and do it, right? They basically, went and wanted to do it. Very simple. Whether there was a buying in from the countries, it was not any. They were not interested. They really wanted to say, "Oh, this is the model. You better do it." So that's the kind of thinking which used to be there in at the time in 90s, and that's the thinking which basically came to Sri Lanka also eventually, and went to India. And India basically, India it developed it, and eventually they succeeded. But in Sri Lanka, it came in, and I don't think there were really many supporters for power sector reforms at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Even among the public, I'm not sure whether there was any support. In the sense they were not sure, and always everybody thought that this is a starting point to privatize, because privatization is taboo, as you know, in all these countries. Even today, privatization is taboo, and so people thought this is a path to privatization and sell off all all these government assets, and government should be doing this business. And so nobody liked it, but it was kind of forced down their throat. Partners link this to development financing. If you want to get funding, you we had to go through this path. So I don't think people liked it that much, as I told you. And then we had, Sri Lanka Electricity Board, the employees of the Sri Lanka Electricity Board, and then you had people, connected to this business in different forms, and the government. So even the government, I'm not sure whether they were really keen, everybody in the government, to do it, but they did it.
And this was the new government in 2000, or the former government?
It's a new government. It's a new government. Basically, I think it's the government which came into power in 2001, 2002.
Ranil Wickramasinghe's government.
Yes, started it. And there was a separate unit set up actually for this kind of work, not only for electricity, but also for water, petroleum, railways, ports, and for all infrastructure sector. There was a separate unit called Public Interest Program Unit, which developed all the legislation, the legal framework, everything else, a regulatory framework, everything, to basically go through that liberalization process.
Mm-hmm.
And electricity was only one part.
Okay, interesting.
That's how it was. But there was no really buying in, on the part of the sector people, particularly at the time.
Stakeholders were not convinced.
But of course, people like us liked it, because we knew this is the way forward, and you have to be one step ahead of other countries around in the region, and we used to be always one step ahead. And so I freshly came back from London, and I had all these dreams of seeing something which is equivalent to in those countries. So I supported it, but then I knew that there was no buying in, and then the regulatory framework. But even at the time, regulatory framework, I think the government really wanted to have it simply because government had genuine interest in leaving the sector day-to-day operations with the sector people at that time, at that particular government. May not be everybody, but at least the higher ups in the government wanted it. That's how independent regulatory agency was being proposed.
Mhm.
And but of course, as you know, 2002 Act never came into being, and that was never gazetted. As a result, it never, it was never operationalized.
I see.
Whereas Public Utilities Commission Act was operationalized in 2003.
That was a separate act.
Separate act, yes. And it was an interesting exercise. I mean, I must say, pilot in that sense, because in this region we never had a multi-sector regulator at the time, and also the type of legislation was slightly different from what they used to have in India, because we had the Public Utilities Commission Act, which is a multi-sector regulator, and then we had the Electricity Act, which is a separate legislation for the sector. And so it's the Public Utilities Commission Act is an umbrella legislation, whereas Sector Act was basically supporting or empowering Public Utilities Commission to regulate that particular sector.
Okay. I think we also wanted to put you on the spot to really figuring out who are the architects of the Public Utilities Commission as it is right now. And of course, like you could have taken many different paths, or Sri Lanka could have taken many different paths in designing the sort of commission structure. And I was explaining to Shiana, like Shiana grew up in California, and in California we have a KAISO, like a independent system operator, and the commission in Sri Lanka is not a system operator; they are just a regulator. But then again, you have this whole big, powerful electric utility. The Ceylon Electricity Board is an all-powerful government utility, and there's the small Public Utilities Commission that don't really have the regulatory power or the teeth to really handle such a big elephant in the room. And then, and of course, as you know, that has led to a lot of problems right now. Were you part of the architects, or who were the architects, or were there sort of different other models that were looked at? Did somebody suggest, oh, let's break down the utility into different parts, or was that not possible? And I think we have a question from the audience, like, why were there no buy-ins from the stakeholders? What was the resistance to it?
Yeah, before answering the question, let me, let me go into the model, why we selected this model. Actually, at the time, I think it's basically the consultants who worked on this, basically decided which model it should be. Of course, there were consultations, there were working groups, consisting of people from the sector, both from Electricity Board and then LECO and all the other related institutions. But the consultants basically brought in various models. And eventually, it's basically it's the consultants' thinking and what would be the best for Sri Lanka. And if you see, you have a similar model even in Bangladesh, and multi-sector regulator sitting there. But of course, it's not as broad as the Sri Lanka regulator, but it's very similar model. Different from India. India, you have only the electricity regulator.
Right. Can you tell us who are the consultants and maybe why they came to this conclusion?
Frankly, I'm not really aware of why they came to this conclusion, but I must say they are very competent consultants. I mean, well-known consultants. I can't remember actually if I can remember PNA. Can't remember. Some consulting firms in London Economics, probably, if I can remember right. And then some consultants from New Zealand, I think, PNA, Power Planning Associates, I'm not sure. Anyway, they were very well-known consultants. And obviously, they would have studied various models. And one thing probably why they ended up with a multi-sector regulator in Sri Lanka is because it's a small country, capacity is limited, and then they thought concentrate all the capacity to regulate different sectors in the same commission is the best way to move forward because capacity is constrained. That may be the reason why they had a multi-sector regulator. That may be. Then everything, the Electricity Act, if you look at the Electricity Act itself, the unbundling part is quite common across the world, the way they have proposed it. But of course, regardless of the size of the system, that's where most of the, stakeholders used to question because we were a very small system at the time, and whether we could afford to unbundle such a small system and overheads and all sorts of other administrative costs associated with it, and whether we really needed such type of unbundling for a smaller system. That was the question raised at the time. As far as the question which came in, why stakeholders were not really, there was no buying in from the stakeholders, mainly because of the fear. One thing I think, electricity was considered to be like water and everything else like a public good. And so the feeling was that probably it should be with the government. Government would take care of the people better than others coming in, private sector coming in. And then even with the government ownership, obviously you could have had, unbundling into government-owned entities if they really wanted. But then the issue was actually the strength of CEB. Probably it was some stakeholders believe that, if CEB loses its strength as a single institution, it might be interfered with more by the politicians, and even the things what the Ceylon Electricity Board could resist when the politicians try to intervene, it wouldn't have been able to do it if it was were to be split into several companies and smaller companies. And so that's one thinking what stakeholders had, and also generally everybody thought that if the government owns it, you get the cheapest electricity. That's the thinking. Even now you have it, right? Where people always believe that. So that was the reason probably buying in wasn't there.
Okay, so I have Mr. Bandula Tilakasena, I think, whom you know very well, saying that he says, I quote, "I remember we all agreed to model option 7, the single buyer structure." And of course, the public was not, of course, at large consulted.
Bandula is going to talk about it or what?
No. Well, I think he's sort of in the audience. He's listening in. Yes. Hasala, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes. So now what I would want to know from Professor Wijayatunga is if you go back, so did you see any flaws in the system? And if you could go back to that time right now, would there be anything you would do different to make it, like we have come to a conclusion that, like we see that the sector is not healthy right now. So if you could go back to 2002, would you have done anything different with respect to setting up the organization or the way, because you were the Director General as well. So what's your personal take on this?
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually. All of us know having an independent regulator is the best thing what the sector can have. Even recently, as you know, I look after the power sector, from ADB side in South Asia. And when it comes to promoting power sector reforms, one thing what I always believe and promote is independent regulation. That's the one which really helps the sector. Unbundling, how much it helps the sector is a different story. It all depends on the size of the sector and the intentions and how you do it and so on and so forth. But independent regulation is very, very critical, very, very critical for the investments in the sector and for the consumers. And at the time, probably, I would have had something like a 2009 Electricity Act in 2002. I think the biggest mistake what the government at the time did was trying to push for 2002 Act with all these unbundling, which created a lot of doubts among the stakeholders. It's unbundling which created a lot of doubts more than anything else. And we could have had 2009 Act at the time of in 2002. Then we would have gone through it. And if we had 2009 Act in 2002, by 2009 or now, probably we would have had 2002 Equivalent Act because the sector would have progressed. And so that's my feeling. So we could have done. Actually, frankly speaking, personally, I contributed a lot to 2009 Act because at the time, as you know, I was in ADB. So I used to sit across the table on this side with ADB and move to the other side. So it was easier to see the views of both sides. And we finally managed to push 2009 Act. And I think that's a far better version at the time compared to 2002 Act. And so 2002 Act was a non-starter. We shouldn't have done that at the time. Yeah.
I do have a question for those of us in the audience who, are maybe new to understanding Sri Lanka's power sector. So could you describe a little bit more about how the regulator, the PUCSL, how its function is different than that of the CEB, the utility, and then the Ministry of Power and Energy? What's their relationship with each other? Because I know, many of us might not know it's too much about the power sector, but we read about it in the news. We see PUCSL and CEB, and there's some kind of, push and pull here. So could you share a little bit more about that relationship? And I do have a follow-up question I'll ask after you answer that.
Yeah. It's a difficult question to answer because it's quite controversial, as you know. But one thing I'll tell you, I tend to believe, because of the ownership structure in the sector, these issues tend to come because Sri Lanka Electricity Board is a government-owned entity, and PUCSL is government in a way, right? Of course, it's an independent regulator, but it's government. It's government. It's a government at a distance anyway. So always, as a big institution, CEB has a lot of clout, a lot of inertia, and it's not easy to regulate something like CEB. But if it were a private institution, yes, it's a slightly different story, because you can take them to courts easily, right, and they have to defend themselves. But if you take CEB to courts, you are basically taking the government to courts in a way, right? It's a very difficult decision to take. As of course, the regulator would have done it, but that's a difficult thing to do. And the Sri Lanka Electricity Board is coming under the Ministry of Power and Energy, or Ministry of Power, Ministry in charge of power, and then it's linked to the government, and it's like government taking government into courts. So it's a very difficult relationship when it is government, right?
So how do you hold them accountable? What is your perspective on that?
I mean, my feeling is that they have to work together. They have to work together. I think that the two institutions have to work together and persuade. You have to get things done by persuading the other party, and take them to courts. It's not easy, as I told you, because it's like taking the government to courts. For instance, if there is an issue with regard to, let's say, planning process, you sit together and try to resolve it, because you're on the same side in a way. But you as the independent regulator, you know what the consumer wants, what the government, what the country wants, and you should be able to push your point across, and then basically persuade. It's only through persuasion you can do things here, because of the ownership structure. It's not easy. Otherwise, there is always a deadlock. Well, what has happened now? What has happened now? So, because if you do the right thing and if you try to persuade, it's very difficult openly any of the parties to say no to anything.
Right.
It's like name and shame. If somebody does something wrong, you basically put that into newspapers, and then you don't. That's the best way to stop people doing the wrong things, right? And you can use that kind of thing to make sure that you do things right. And when the government is on both sides, it's not that easy.
Mm-hmm. It seems like right now there's two camps, one from the CEB and the engineer side, and there's the Public Utilities Commission sort of battling it out on open in the media most days. Shiana, did you have I think you had a follow-up question?
So I was, researching the PUCSL, the CEB, Ministry of Power and Energy, and I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out who makes the final decision on tariffs. I still have, after hours of reading, I still can't tell you. And I discussed this with Thisara last night, and I think we're both kind of, going back and forth onto who makes the decision on the prices that consumers pay for electricity at the end of the day.
Yeah. I was telling Shan, I don't have a good answer, like who's the final authority. Sometimes somebody decides, and then there's sort of political intervention. The president or like the prime minister would, at the end of the day, sort of finalize the decision. I suppose ideally in a ideal world, the Public Utilities Commission was sort of there to insulate the system from political interference and sort of having too many interests. So I mean, there are obviously interests in the energy sector, but sort of balance them out. Then of course, if the president or somebody else are doing the final decision, I suppose, I think I'm sort of paraphrasing your question. It is, do they have the authority, or should that happen? Or it's sort of mess, at least for me. When I've lived in Sri Lanka, and I don't understand who's the final authority. Maybe Professor can shed some light.
At least I can't remember exactly the 2009 Act, but the expectation is that it is final authority is the Public Utilities Commission.
Okay.
And whether there should be an endorsement from the minister or not, I am not sure, because there was some thought when it comes to drafting the 2009 Act, some level of government endorsement will have to be there. I can't remember that, but otherwise, its final authority is the Public Utilities Commission. So, the Public Utilities Commission's responsibility is to, issue the tariff orders and decide on the tariff, not the structure and the level of tariff. Yes, it is public.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Sorry.
Shanna, go ahead, Shanna.
Yeah. Well, the CEB as the service provider, the utility, I guess it's up to them to provide the cost of supply, correct, to the PUCSL. But from my understanding, is that communication not happening on a regular basis? Because I think from what we know, tariffs are not covering the cost of supply right now. So that's one thing that's led to the financial struggles of the sector, right? So is that one of the main issues that are happening right now between the two entities?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact details of it, but it seems like there may be a dispute between the costs produced, given by the CEB and the costs accepted by Public Utilities Commission, or it may not be even issuing tariff orders now. I think there is a delay in issuing tariff orders. Obviously, costs provided by CEB may be contested by Public Utilities Commission. And at the same time, they may not be issuing tariff orders on time. I can't remember. I don't know exactly the specifics of it. But what we all know is that the Sri Lanka Electricity Board is running at a loss. Right. So that is obviously somebody is getting the numbers wrong. Right. And so that's a serious flaw in the system. And somebody is not doing the right thing. And it has to be corrected. At least there should be some transparency to show that this much of money is missing from somebody, because this subsidy should be coming in from somewhere. Mm-hmm. And that's why the tariff is low. And what I actually, in fact, from our side, when we try to provide assistance to power sector, one thing what I'm trying to advocate is that, I mean, running at a loss is one problem, and not showing it properly, that, somewhere in the accounts you can say that these are the receivables from the government, because the subsidy, according to the Act, if there should be a subsidy in the system, it will have to be provided. If you look at the Indian system, it's very clear. Now I'm dealing with one loan, in Uttar Pradesh. When you look at the financial statements, it's very clear. The government clearly gives this much of money to the utility to subsidize the agricultural consumers or domestic consumers, and it will have to come from the government. It will have to be transparent and shown in the financial accounts. And unfortunately, I don't think that is shown in our accounts anywhere, and that's a flaw. And I will say, put that in as a receivable from the government. If you're making losses, it should not be losses per se. It should be basic. You make losses because the government subsidy is not come. It should be shown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but then, so there is this argument: if you try to show that, it will be taxed, and then you will lose more.
Right.
But then, there is no justification not having it. Right. So that's an issue. That's an issue which needs to be resolved. And the government needs to step in. Obviously, tariffs are subsidized because of the government interest. So that money will have to come to the sector from the government.
Interesting. Uh-huh. I've seen, sort of financial experts comment on it, as the circular debt in the Sri Lankan economy. It's sort of like a vicious cycle because the government isn't subsidizing the loss or the loss of income, loss of revenue. Then, of course, the CB sort of borrows from the People's Bank, if I'm not mistaken, to sort of pay for all the petroleum corporations. Or sort of like there's like this big fat black hole, like a elephant debt sort of going back and forth within the system. If I may, I'd like to put Hustler on the spotlight now. So Hustler is an expert. He was telling me about how the Public Utilities Commission process happens in the U.S., like especially in your state in South Carolina. Like, can you maybe comment on the process of like really expert witnesses and sort of getting the truth and getting the real numbers? And as Professor mentioned, there's seems like there's a problem with the real information. There's a lack of accountability, sort of like, or somebody's not giving the information. How can we resolve it? Is it sort of a problem with the structure? Is it a problem with the people? Maybe Hasala can sort of comment on like 1 or 2 minutes, and then we can go back to Professor.
Yes. So Tisara, one thing I want to say, and I want to highlight what Professor Wijayatunga said, is that in the Act, in 2009 Act, it's explicitly stated that whatever subsidy that the sector is giving out should be given by the government. So the commission should give that to, commission should say this is a subsidy and give it to the government, and then the government should give that subsidy. So that's part of the Act. So it's not like we don't have the laws to ensure that, that this does not happen. But what I feel is that the utility is not asking for a rate case. They're not filing for the rates. Like, you need to go through the process, and they're not doing that. And that's why, they do not want to go through that because it's such a hell of a lot of work, a lot of filing. And it's the same in South Carolina as well. They don't want to, so they would be rather willing to run at a loss rather than file for a rate case. That's how far they will go, because it's a lot of things happening which sometimes they're not aware of, but they do need to take that into account, because that's how they become like financially strong and really be sustainable business. Now on to this, 2 minutes on this, okay? On to this, how it's done in South Carolina. So in South Carolina, you have an office of regulatory staff, which has the same standing as the utility or pro se litigant like me. So I had the same standing as the utility, which was filing for the rate case. And there were some advocates. There were advocates for energy users. There were advocates for solar users. There were advocates for different groups, 5, 6, 7, 8, something like that. So ORS represents the government, whereas the commission represents the parliament. So the people is represented by the commission, who is totally independent. For instance, any interaction that the ORS, the Office of the Regulatory Staff, has with the commission should be done in an official way. So they are distinct bodies. So if the utility puts in a rate case, then they give standing to all these parties, and it goes to a civil. So we had this discussion with Mr. Bandul and with you as well in ISL, and Dileepa was also there, Dileepa Karunaratne from UCSL. So when the PUCSL gives the proposal, people come and say, we need to be a party, and the commission approves or disapproves based on, they rule on that. So you have parties, utility and interest parties, they give their suggestions, and then you have then the utility says why these proposals are wrong or correct, and if they agree on the different amendments, they change that. And then it goes through a rebuttal, a surbuttal, the civil litigation process. That's how it works. And so the utility does not feel that their voice is not heard, because it's not like the commission and the ORS working together to put in the agenda. So the government gives their policy to ORS, and the parliament gives their requirement. The representation of the parliament is with the commission. And then everybody sees that they have, that their voice is heard, and people in the public can see the hearing, and they can decide what's true, what's false. And think that
Right,
is sort of
right.
the process, and I was very
Exactly.
impressed by it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what Hasila was also trying to say was there's like a good process of, like examining and cross-examination of, some of the facts presented during, during a public hearing. And whereas, of course, the Sri Lankan Utility Commission, the public hearings tend
So,
to be a little bit less organized. Yes, Hasila.
yes, so it's not exact. It's a rate case,
Uh-huh.
but it's not exactly a public hearing in that they did have public hearings in 3 places, night hearings, but so that was just recorded.
Okay.
And people did listen to, so the commissioners listened to that and they quoted that in their ruling. In the case it's quoted like what they got, the summary what they got. So the Duke Energy was trying to increase the fixed cost 3 times, as I have explained to you, because they wanted to get the distribution charges to be cost reflective. From their point of view, it was not, and the PV users were misusing it. It was cross subsidization in the sector. That was their argument. But so the public hearings were there, but this was a rate case. This was like serious business where you have the lawyers representing different entities. But it was public, so that is there. So there's a little bit difference in that. Yeah.
Of course. Sorry. Yes, I understand completely. I wonder if Professor would like to comment if, at least in your time at the Public Utilities Commission, did you try to set up a rigorous process to understand certain, or is it too soon, or like is Sri Lanka not enough?
Yeah. Thank you. Just to let you know, as I told you, the way the legislation, Public Utilities Commission Act,
Yeah. Professor, we can't hear you very well.
yeah.
I need to get a little closer.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
And now better.
The way the legislation in Sri Lanka has been designed in such a way that until the Electricity Act came into being, Public Utilities Commission could not regulate the electricity sector. Right? And the sector legislation should have been in place, because in other countries you have Electricity Act, which basically looks at the regulator as well as the sector as a whole. But here you have a regulatory act separately and the sector act separately. They are independent. And then the sector act basically empowers the regulator to regulate the sector. And so 2009, until the 2009 Act came into being, there was no formal regulation of the sector by the Public Utilities Commission. So that was the situation, which means during my time, I never regulated the electricity sector.
Interesting.
So all my involvement with the electricity sector during my time was basically informal interaction, and all what we did we did a lot of work in the electricity sector through informal interaction. That's what I say, when you have all these government institutions together, you can do a lot. You can do a lot. We had a very big, for instance, electricity tariff revision in 2008, if I can remember right. 40% increase in tariff. We did
40%?
Yeah, if I can remember, one of the biggest increases at the time. And we never had the electricity sector under Public Utilities Commission at the time. But it's all through, all the stakeholders coming together and working together. So we can do that. We could do that. Now, after 2009, of course, so what I was trying to say that there was no formal public hearings, no formal tariff orders at the time, during my time. So in that sense, I have never had personal experience with the Public Utilities Commission having tariff orders or public hearings. But just to go back to Hasela's comment on how regulators operate in the US, it's slightly different actually. Because there, as you quite rightly said, the staff of the commission is different from the commission in the US. That's very clear in all, not only in North Carolina, but right across the US. US Public Utilities Commissions, the commissioners are judges. They're judges. They're bench of judges who judge based on the case presented by all stakeholders, including the staff of the commission. So staff of the commission is another stakeholder. They have to defend they of course come up with all the tariff proposals, blah, 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 everything. and they have to defend it like any other stakeholder. And they have to intervene. Then the commission takes the call. Okay, whether the staff is right or whether you take, listen to others and everything else. So in Sri Lanka, it's not the case. In Sri Lanka, the staff of the commission and the commission one and the same. And so you take all the information from other stakeholders and you take a decision and go to the public hearing with that decision to see whether it's reasonable. And other stakeholders will have to argue out and say, no, you have to change this, you have to change that, and so on. So that's the difference. And also, the commission does not have judicial powers in Sri Lanka.
Oh, they don't have traditional. Okay.
You have to go to courts if you want to get an order.
I see.
Yes.
That seems like a very inefficient way of resolving things, like going back again to the courts.
Not necessarily. A lot of things you can do, but it does not have judicial powers.
Of course. I mean, thank you, Professor. I mean that was a long explanation. I know, like, very emotions running high. I'm curious. I think we are sort of running out of a lot of time. We want to be respectful of everybody's time. I want to sort of maybe last few questions. I want to sort of move to Shiana. Like, looking forward, she has some good questions. I think you can sort of let us about. I think a lot of attendees and audience really wanted to talk about, not just the past, but how does the past influence, the future and the present. Shiana.
Thank you. Well, we can start with the present. One of the main reasons of this series is to understand the power sector reforms, or maybe lack thereof, that set the stage for the current circumstances in the country. One being power cuts. Right, 2 weeks ago, there was a power plant failure that led to a 7-hour blackout, and now citizens are seeing daily scheduled power cuts. And for me, I'm seeing that as a massive problem, not just for Sri Lankans who are losing power during the workday as they're working from home or going to the hospital, but this is also a big concern for the confidence of investors that want to pour capital into Sri Lanka. So when I was speaking earlier in our conversation, I thought of this as how can Sri Lanka's economic growth be propelled, right? What can we do to improve that trajectory? And electricity reliability is really one of those factors, right? And so I'm wondering, knowing what you know now, could any of this have been prevented? Could these, I think this might be something that someone from the CEB might be able to speak a little bit more on, but from the regulator's perspective, could we, was there enough resources to foresee some of these challenges that the country is facing today?
Yeah, I mean, immediate reason is, of course, there was no adequate generation. This particular failure is slightly different because obviously as it's published on the newspapers and so on, it's a mistake on the part of some of the maintenance staff. But there are issues. Actually, generation, not having adequate generation is a major issue, and the system is running with a very thin margin. So when you have a disaster or other failure like this, bringing system back into the restoration of the system may not be that easy. And also, that's on the generation side. And then, of course, a very important thing is that, looking into things like protection coordination and also some other things, which small things looks small, but they are not that small. You need to really get into those details and get those fine-tuned so that, restoration can be faster. In fact, ADB has been helping CEB quite a lot to get these things done. And in the past, for instance, 2017-16, we had power failures, and after that we also supported Ceylon Electricity Board to investigate what the issues are, and some of the assistance which we provided channel to sort out some of those issues. And even in the recent power failure, we have been asked to really investigate what exactly happened, the technical reasons why restoration took a longer time, and we are in the process of helping the CEB to do that. But important thing is that get those things, sorted out and add generation on a regular basis so that we have adequate generation. That's very, very important. If you don't have adequate generation, whatever you do, it doesn't matter. The system can fail and restoration may not be that easy.
Exactly. I think it goes back to the former question again, like, can the president or somebody really like interfere like in 2015 or 2016? I think when sort of somebody interfered from the top to stop some of the planned generation capacity additions to the system.
Uh, yeah, I mean, obviously, as I said, all these are government-owned entities. The government can either do it or not do it. So, because it's basically the direction can come from the top. I mean, to tell you one example, I'm not politically aligned to anybody, but I can remember 2005 when the new government came into power. One of the first things what they did was went and had the initiated the coal power plant construction, right, and which was long delayed. And so that was government, direct, role in it. And then it got into place. I mean, it commissioned, the power plant was commissioned very, very fast. And so that kind of strong government decision is required to do certain things. But I'm not saying that you should do anything, but you should do the right thing. And that right decision will have to be taken at the right time.
Of course. So let's sort of try to end on like renewable energy or like sort of one final set of questions before we sort of move on. So I think based on Shiana's question also, I wanted to ask, and given that, and I think we all agree that we want to promote more and more renewable energy investments in Sri Lanka, and of course that might come from private sector, if not the government. And sometimes when you sort of look at private sector renewable investments, there seems to be a lot of barriers, especially in a country like Sri Lanka. Like there's maybe problems with obtaining land, which are sort of owned by the government, and maybe there are licenses, or sometimes if the CEP doesn't sort of ask for renewable energy input, sort of can they go on sort of really connect, like when I mean renewable energy, sometimes utility scale investments in wind plants or utility scale solar. Do you think that should be the regulator's responsibility to really address some of the barriers or challenges to private participation of renewable energy investments? And of course, a follow-up would be, should you think there should be like the utility should also look at the reliability and the resilience of the system long term? I know that's like two questions. Go ahead, sir. Over to you.
All right. Frankly speaking, all these stakeholders, I mean, the utility, the Public Utilities Commission, the government, all these three stakeholders, or Sustainable Energy Authority too, because that's also a regulator on resource, development. So
Right.
all these four will have to work together because different people, different institutions will have to address these issues in different ways. I mean, I fully agree. We have to obviously go for more and more renewables. Then system stability, system reliability will have to be taken care of, and that's CEB's responsibility. So CEB should be very justly concerned about it, and how much of renewable energy can be brought in, and what kind of technology we have to adapt to ensure that such renewable energy technology can be brought in. And so that's their responsibility. At the same time, Public Utilities Commission has its own role to make sure the other stakeholders, CEB and the government policies properly filtered down to the CEB to ensure that government policy is taken forward. And then Sustainable Energy Authority when it comes to resource allocation, and will have to be carefully taken care of. So it's all these institutions should work together. That's what I say. There is no one institution dictating the other. It will have to work together, and it's only through persuasion you can do things, because all these are government owned. That you have to remember. And we, like consumers like us, are the ones who are on the other side suffering or enjoying the benefits of it, depending on the type of decisions taken by these stakeholders.
I think we need to be respectful of everybody's time and your time too, Professor. Do we have like a final set of remarks or questions from you guys, Hasala, Shiana?
From me, I mean, I'm just grateful to hear some very insightful answers to many of the questions I've had. As someone, both on the outside looking into Sri Lanka's power sector, but also as someone who's, again, invested in seeing some of these major challenges addressed. So thank you so much, Professor Wijayatunga. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So yeah, so I have never had an opportunity to interact with Professor Wijayatunga, though he and Professor Lucas and our awesome faculty who was at the time I chose electrical was so though he inspired me, I did not have. So I'm really thankful for the opportunity and for you coming here on a Saturday evening. So I do have one last question, and this is, so with regard to the framework we have, do you think, apart from like people, persuasion and how people interact with each other, it depends on the person, but is there a difference? Is there anything we can do on the structure itself to ensure that we have minimum friction possible? So like now we want your answer as a futurist, as a visionary, like what would you do? So assume that the PUCSL, they don't want to work. Like the people, they have their enemies, personal enemies of CB, whoever, and the advocates, they're all enemies personally, and they want to like screw it up. So how would we do this? How could we put the framework so that it minimizes the friction? So, okay, what do you?
It's a very difficult question to answer, frankly, particularly in the context of Sri Lanka. I'll tell you, because one important thing is that, as you can see, the legal framework is almost perfect, and you have a very strong Public Utilities Commission in the Act. You have, Ceylon Electricity Board Act. You have the, Electricity Act 2009. They're very strong. It's very clear who is in charge of what. What is most important is that you should think of the institution. You should not think that you are an individual. You have to forget about your individual side of it. You have to look after the interests of the institution and work along with the legislation or the legal framework you have. So that's one of the problems. I mean, in general, not just in the sector, in Sri Lanka is that even though legislation empowers you, you never exercise that power. That's the problem. You have to, it's not just independent regulator or independent institution which matters, but the necessity to enjoy or exercise, that is lacking in Sri Lanka. Whether it's power sector or any other sector, all these legislation, if you look at, the people at the top are really independent. They have to be independent. But I don't think anybody exercises that independence. That's the problem. That's my worry. In fact, that is a lesson which I learned. And as a result, I might not advocate independent regulation in other countries where I work. That's the problem. Yeah, that's an issue.
Of course. And thank you so much for your insights, Professor. I think that's of course a big problem in the Sri Lankan sector. And I think as Asians, we sort of tend to have a sort of different mindset to, and in the Western world, you look at institutions and powerful regulators. I think Asians tend to look at, more personalities and, people to people connections. I think maybe for better or for worse, that's how things work, and that's why we can't really decouple personalities from the energy sector sometimes. We work more with people and less with institutions. And I don't know where the balance is. I think that's sort of like, figuring it out is a challenge, how, Asian culture and, how do you fit in like independent regulation goes forward. I think, and I also want to thank Professor to really taking up the time. And I think when I was an undergraduate in 2014, I remember, you came to a talk at Moratuwa. We had a good chat about, how you were looking at the South Asian, the India, Sri Lanka, the submarine cable interconnection, and you were inspiring us, telling, and one day Sri Lanka will be able to take, buy energy from Nepal and Bhutan, and then some of the hydropower projects. That was very fascinating. Hopefully, another time we'll be, yeah. It's like there's a lot to talk about that. Hopefully another time, given that you are sort of looking at South Asian projects and the sector in general, I think we'd love to tap into your knowledge another time also on like the regional sector.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. It's
Yeah.
very
Thank
nice.
you so much, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
All
you,
the best.
Professor. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Okay.
Keep in touch, Professor. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who
Okay.
joined us today.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, good night. Bye.
Good night.
Of
Bye.
course. And thank you to everybody who is joining with us with policy.lk, and be with us. And of course, we have a few speakers lined up in the future. I think I will reveal those names in the future. Isn't that so, Hasala?
Yes, we should have some people to talk with and talk about issues in a more, where people who are actually in it can get something out of it. It requires some background, but this is something that we really don't have in the mainstream media, and it's like people, intellectuals, just working in the CB. They work with their own team and then utility commission, but we need to have that platform, and I think it's something that we can provide.
Exactly.
Because we don't have any interest on it, like
we don't have an
we don't,
interest in it.
yeah, like
We are sort of purely academic, so we don't represent any sides. And then
not just academic, but we do want things to improve. We do want to help. We do have our personal perceptions, but we don't have any financial or even administrative or even career based weight on what we say. So we are very, very independent, and we can say whatever, especially because we live so far away, and we can just say, we can be very independent because of that too. Right, Ciara?
We all want to see the best things happen in Sri Lanka and for all of our friends and family back home, right? So I think it's a good mix of both.
Exactly. Anyway, I want to thank you both also, and Shiana and Hasala, taking your time, especially on a Saturday morning here in the US. And of course, really thankful to the audience who've been sort of with us from the beginning. So keep with us. Hopefully today you found the discussion today very interesting, and we have a lineup of people, and they'll come up very soon. And thank you so much, Hasala and Shiana, and thank you for Asit for the technical assistance.
Okay, guys, stay safe.
All right,
Then
guys.
see you around. Bye.
Stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.